Hello, everyone, and welcome back to English 1120 War and Literature. This is lecture 4. Last time we talked about an introduction to Homer, Homeric epic, the type of background material that will help you read the Iliad. So right now, today, we're going to get right into the work as such. You are to have read book 1, so we'll start to talk about book 1 of the Iliad today. A reminder, we're using the Robert Fagel's translation, and if you do have the text, this is what it looks like. It's quite a handsome volume. Of course, you didn't need to purchase it. As I mentioned in our course logistics lecture, the reading is online. It's just if you did purchase the text as such. So we'll be reading book 1, and as always, we have a PowerPoint presentation to visually guide you through the points that I'll be making. So I'll share that now. I'll call that up. So the series of lectures is called Homer's Iliad, Poem of War and Death. And today, we're going to focus on book 1, The Rage of Achilles. We're going to discuss within that, we're going to discuss the struggle for honor and glory in the confrontation between Agamemnon and Achilles, what's going on there in terms of the high valuation that Homer's epic and Greek culture put on honor and glory at this stage. Also, a quick note on ring composition, so you'll understand what that means when we discuss it in book 1. So there's a symmetrical pattern to book 1 when we look at it. If we have time, I'd also like to go quickly over some aspects of the nature of warfare in the Iliad generally, okay? And then for later lectures, we'll look at these other books. So today, the book 1, The Rage of Achilles. Last time when we talked about a general introduction to Homer, we went over this epic invocation. I won't read it again, but I'll just remind you the first word is rage. It's sing goddess of the rage of Achilles, but in the actual Greek text, the first word is rage. So it's kind of the theme of, in some respects, the theme of the actual work. And a reminder as well that the work begins as Horace later on would say, in medias res, or in the middle of the subject, or in the middle of things. And because as a poet working with traditional narratives, he could assume that his audience would know some of the backstory. He didn't have to fill that in right away, and he could pick up in the middle of these things. Also, a reminder, the Iliad is not going to tell the whole story. It presents one crucial episode in the last year of the Trojan War, but it doesn't in any way doesn't represent the whole war or the events leading up to that crucial episode. Notably, Achilles' own death is not shown in the Iliad. The Trojan horse, the famous Trojan horse, and the sack of Troy, also not shown in the Iliad. But the bard Homer does frequently allude to these and other important events that we'll need to know as we go in and make sure that we have that in the back of our minds. So on the basic level, the subject, as I said, is rage, or in Greek, menace of Achilles. So the rage of Achilles, this anger that he has at being slighted by Agamemnon, causes him to withdraw from the fighting and leave his fellow Greeks to suffer great losses at the hands of the Trojans. So this causes, let's say, the strife that is the motor of the narrative. And we'll note too that the word that Homer uses for the rage of Achilles, menace, is a word often used in reference to the gods, not humans. So we'll notice in a number of ways, Achilles is shown as in some ways not quite human, as either surpassing humanity, but also beyond the limits of humanity in a negative sense, surpassing the limits in a sense of going outside of human station. So why is Achilles angry? He's angry because Agamemnon took away his concubine Briseis, and why that's important is the Homeric warrior is fighting for honor, or time in Greek, and glory or fame, kleos. So time is honor in the sense of a tangible prize that's won, physical expression, a booty, a geros is a particular prize. Then Briseis was Achilles' geros for a particular victory. And kleos is literally what other people say about you. It's fame in the sense of what is spoken aloud about you. It's linguistically related to the English verb to call, I call, and in Greek, kallo. So the two terms are interrelated. So if a warrior has accumulated a lot of time because of tangible prizes, because of prowess, then they're more likely to have lasting fame or glory. People are going to talk about those feats. So in this system, honor's a kind of what we now today call a zero-sum game. There's only so much of it to go around. These external tangible recognitions of one's superiority to others is dissimilar from what let's say the Judeo-Christian sense of honor or virtue as this kind of infinite resource within the interiority of one's soul. So rather than that, if one person is given the highest honors, it means that others will be robbed of potentially equally high honor or those types of honors. And I'll just note that Agamemnon says, as I note here in the second bullet, that he says to Achilles that he will take Briseis away from Achilles so you can learn just how much greater I am than you. So that's in book 1. The other thing I want to note is, and this will relate to a later book that we're going to read by Shakespeare, Henry V. It's this notion of honor as opposed to the Christian notion of honor as kind of an interior charity. It's something that doesn't need to have great spectacles and these types of things. Henry V will try to reinstill this classical notion of honor as opposed to the Christian notion of passivity. In what's called the St. Crispin's Day speech, he wants the happy few, the small band of English, British soldiers that are there. He wants them and wants them to feel that they are fortunate and that they will not need to share the glory and honor with many fellow comrades. If there had been a large army, they would have had to share the honor with a great deal of other people, but because they are so few, that means that they're all the more fortunate. And this attitude of Henry V's before the Battle of Agincourt is similar to this notion expressed by Achilles when he wishes that all the Greeks would leave so that Patroclus and he could conquer Troy themselves, and that's in book 16. So similarly, in this notion of honor and glory, Glaucus describes the teaching of his father to Diomedes. He says, "Always be the best, my boy, the bravest, and hold your head up high above the others." That's in book 6. So note this notion of honor as outdoing others is in contradistinction to a later Greek. So this is, let's say, an archaic Greek notion of within the Homeric period of honor, of virtue as outdoing others in this battle for honor, this battle for glory. Slightly later, during the classical period, the first philosophers, and Plato, obviously the a very famous and leading Greek philosopher, has Socrates in the Republic call into question this notion of virtue. So for Socrates, virtuous behavior is acting in accordance with a standard of the virtue. So just as a good, he says in the Republic, he says, just as a good musician attempts to play well in accordance with the standards of music, not by outdoing other musicians. They're not, their goal is not to outdo other musicians. They're trying to hit the notes and the tune and the rhythm appropriate to the music, not in competition, not in terms of outdoing others. On the other hand, as opposed to that notion of virtue as an appropriate standard, as I said, the Homeric notion of honor and virtue is one of competition, is one of outdoing others. So Time and kleos are closely related, as I mentioned. Kleos serves as the only true form of immortality available to the Homeric heroes. So the only way that they can live on is in what people say about them after they are dead. So there is an afterlife in ancient Greek thinking, you know, and we will see that. We're not going to read the Odyssey, but you do see that in the Odyssey, in Odysseus's descent to the underworld. He sees some souls that have perished, including Achilles, including Agamemnon, and he interacts with them. What we see there, and what we see in other depictions of the underworld by ancient Greek poets, is that this existence is very shadowy. You know, they're not really conscious. They flit about. They're not really conscious. They're not really able to interact with one another or with their surroundings until they're given the sacrificial blood, and then they can interact and speak with the person who has visited them. So it's not really much of an existence. In fact, Achilles says, notably, when Odysseus visits him in, this is book 11 of the Odyssey, Achilles says he'd far rather be the poorest serf in the land of the living than the king of the underworld. The underworld, the world of souls after death, is no picnic. It's no notable existence, and the most miserable existence in the land of the living is more noteworthy, let us say, than that existence. So that, all that being said, that means that the only immortality that these Greek heroes really can strive for is to have their names, their glory, live after them, and they seek imperishable glory. Kleos aptiton, as it is in Greek. So Hector thinks of kleos aptiton when he realizes he is about to die, and this is book 22, so towards the end. Well, let me die, but not without struggle, not without glory, no, in some great clash of arms that even men to come will hear of down the years. And similarly, Helen laments that the deeds of Paris and her will live after them in infamy, not kleos. Agamemnon dishonors Achilles because of an affront to his own teammate. So the background of again, why the rage of Achilles. So Achilles is upset because Agamemnon stole his Geros, his war prize. Agamemnon did that because his own war prize, Chryses, was taken away as a result of the plague described at the outset of the Iliad. So Agamemnon has suffered a loss of his own time or honor, since he had to return his war prize, the concubine Chryses, to her father Chryses. The plague, so Chryses is a priest of Apollo, and Chryses pleaded with Agamemnon at the beginning of the Iliad. Agamemnon turns him away brusquely. He prays to Apollo, since he's a Chryses is a priest of Apollo. He prays to Apollo to send a plague on the Greeks, which Apollo does. Finally, the Greeks convince Agamemnon to return Chryses, Chryses' daughter, and as a result, Agamemnon has lost his own prize. So one thing I'll note here is Agamemnon's reception at the beginning here of Chryses. We can see that in contradistinction to the end of the Iliad, and we'll come back to that in a couple lectures. We'll see in book 24, the last book of the Iliad, Achilles' reception of Priam. So both of them are, there's a father supplicating and begging for the release of a child, and Agamemnon flatly refuses, no sympathy. Achilles' reception is much more hospitable and pliant towards the end of the Iliad. Achilles has learned, has grown, has realized he has to re-enter the land of living humans, so to speak. I'm going to turn to the actual text now quickly, so that we can see the text. So this is very early on in the Iliad. So this is book 1. It's after the invocation that we just discussed. So the lines 1 to 10. Incensed at the king, he swept a fatal plague. So this is Apollo. So what was the cause of all this rage? It was caused initially by Apollo. Apollo, incensed at the king, Agamemnon, he swept a fatal plague through the army. Men were dying, and all because Agamemnon spurned Apollo's priests. Yes, Chryses approached the Achaeans' fast ships. So remember, Achaeans is another word for Greeks. So Homer will use Achaeans, he will use Argives, but those are just different words for basically the Greeks, the different cities that comprise the Greek cohort. Chryses approached the Achaeans' fast ships to win his daughter back, bringing a priceless ransom, and bearing high in hand, wound on a golden staff, the wreaths of the god, the distant deadly archer. He begged the whole Achaean army, but most of all the two supreme commanders, Atreus' two sons, Agamemnon, Menelaus, all Argives geared for war. May the gods who hold the halls of Olympus give you Priam's city to plunder, then safe passage home. Just set my daughter free, my dear one, here. Accept these gifts, this ransom. Honor the god who strikes from worlds away, the son of Zeus, Apollo. And all ranks of Achaeans cried out their assent. Respect the priest, accept the shining ransom. But it brought no joy to the heart of Agamemnon. The king dismissed the priest with a brutal order ringing in his ears. Never again, old man, let me catch sight of you by the hollow ships. Not loitering now, not slinking back tomorrow. The staff and the wreaths of the god will never save you then. The girl, I won't give up the girl. Long before that, old age will overtake her in my house, in Argos, far from her fatherland, slaving back and forth at the loom, forced to share my bed. Now go, don't tempt my wrath, and you may depart alive. So we see, again, a very unsympathetic, let's say, presentation of Agamemnon there. And I don't think we're meant to see a certain short-sightedness and limited vision there in Agamemnon, as being part of the motor of the events that are cause the suffering of the Greeks. He doesn't listen to his troops who are obviously responsive to this pleading father, and the troops obviously see how this is going to benefit them and not offend the gods. These types of things. He doesn't listen to this pleading, and it leads ultimately to the Greek ruin to some extent. So then Achilles and Agamemnon have a heated exchange in the Greek council. Nestor intervenes with wise words of an elder statesman, and he's established as a man of rhetorical skill, and he criticizes both the stance of Agamemnon and Achilles. So again, Agamemnon is shown as not heeding the wise words of this statesman, Nestor. So I'll refer you to those lines. Those are in the Fagel's translation. And we won't turn to them at this time, but I'd refer you to those lines. A couple things I'd like to point out. So in those lines, Nestor is highlighted for, he's known for his wise words. He's too old to be, let's say, very skilled at arms anymore. So he's mostly known for his words or politics, so to speak. He also, in his speech, Nestor refers to the fact that he's older, and he fought alongside an older generation of heroes, such as Thetis, and all of these heroes were better than today's generation. So this was a theme that will recur in the Iliad, and actually in other Greek works, is this notion that the previous generations, the past, the ancestors, were better in every way than the current generation. So this is very much tied to, let's say, traditional culture that is tied to ancestral values. And what will happen with the kind of, let's say, the philosophic revolution later on in classical Greece will be a questioning of the ancestral values. So it's very akin to what later on, in relation to the Christian Middle Ages, the Enlightenment was, or even the Renaissance to some extent, was as a questioning of these accepted standards of medieval ritual and practice, of Christian practice, etc. So here too, this notion that for Nestor, for the Greeks, the ancestral ways, as represented by these great generations before us, are the ancestors themselves were great. What they did must be awesome. So we must follow those practices, what they did, try to respect what they did, try to learn and retell the stories of what they did. So this is all part and parcel of that way of thinking about the ancestral as better than today. Whereas to some extent, I think we live with post-Enlightenment again with the sense that we're always getting better. You know, we have not much to learn from the past. What's the past going to tell us about how to create a better computer processor or a better kind of clean source of energy? They were a source of blind spots. They were racist. They had political blind spots. They had blind spots in terms of their knowledge of the natural world. What can they teach us? So two very different, let's say, scientific versus traditional ancestral community. So Achilles' response, he responds by withdrawing from the battle by actively seeking the Greeks' temporary defeat. So he declares he'll no longer fight against the Trojans, and he threatens actually to take all of his myrmidons home, and so they would also be losing those troops. But in any case, he summons his mother Thetis, so his mother is a goddess, and asks her to petition Zeus to let the Trojans gain dominance over the Greeks until they've relented and once again returned his teammate or his honor. So Achilles' response is excessive, and even Nestor, the speech we didn't turn to, but I pointed you to, if Nestor also had words of censure for Achilles. So if Achilles were wise, he would have also listened to these wise words of Nestor. So Achilles' response is excessive, but to a lot of readers today, it's absolutely outside the pale. Why would he go to his ships and sulk like that just because, you know, the king took Briseis? You know, it seems like it's kind of an extreme response to the situation, which, you know, leading as it does to the deaths of many Greeks. I think it's somewhat understandable. What I want to highlight, though, is that it's somewhat understandable in the context of this honor culture of the Greeks, that what's often called a shame culture in cultural anthropology. So the world of the Homeric warriors is a shame culture in this sense, in which a warrior's sense of worth, their sense of their identity, is determined by how they're perceived by others and what others say. So one's worth arises in external manifestations of one's worth, right? As opposed to a guilt culture. And this is another way of articulating what I was mentioning before in terms of kind of the Christian tradition that will come along later in the West, is really this sense of internalizing guilt. My own sense of self-worth is less tied to whether, according to this, whether I have these honors from others, whether I have a shiny medal, these types of things. It's based on my own sense of whether or not I'm in tune with God's, let's say, plan for me, whether I think that I've lived according to a virtuous, holy path that aligns me with divine intention. I wonder, as I was saying, this notion of kind of external manifestations of one's worth, to some extent in today's materialist culture, there's a sense of that. Again, you know, this sense of an externalization of one's worth. You know, someone's worth is only as much as, you know, their likes on their social media pages, the amount of flex they're able to do. I think that's the term the kids use, you know, in terms of being able to show off a lot of material goods because of their wealth, no matter what the wealth, however it was, you know, garnered, you know. So there could be, to some extent, that not really a shame culture, but it's a sense of one's worth is tied to external manifestations of one's worth. So Thetis, Achilles' mother, is upset that Achilles is so upset. Achilles is weeping, and goes to Zeus to try to persuade him to intervene. Zeus agrees that the Trojans will have temporary ascendance, although he can't alter the end, the fated downfall of Troy. So we'll talk a bit about that in another lecture. The role of the gods in relation to fate, and a bit of a complex relationship there. So the gods, and in particular the most powerful god, Zeus, does have and can steer events, obviously, one way or the other, but there is a fated unfolding of things that cannot be overturned by any of the gods. So this edict from Zeus allows Homer to show, as I note here, it allows us to show kind of the Greeks losing without, let's say, offending his Greek audience. So his audience are Greeks, and he wants to show that they're, you know, they were indestructible, that they're great soldiers, and in a way, like let's say the tension of the narrative is caused because the Trojans are actually beating them for a while, and they're actually outmatching the Greeks. But basically underlying all that is basically Homer saying it's only because Zeus was on their side for a while there. It's don't take offense to what I'm saying. Another point there I want to highlight in terms of this point of book one is that a subtle narrative juxtaposition that highlights the excessive nature of Achilles' rage. So Odysseus returns Chryses to Chryses, her father, by ship. And they appeal to the god Apollo to end the plague that was sent on the Greeks. And the narrator notes, quote, "And Apollo listened, his great heart warm with joy." So that's line 566 in the Fagel's translation. So we see an appeal and Apollo soften. And this softening of the rage of Apollo is contrasted by the narrator immediately with Achilles back at the Greek camp. So the narrator says, only 15 lines later, quote, "But he raged on, grimly camped by his fast fleet." So there's these appeals, Apollo relents, but he raged on. So raged on are in a sense of being even, let's say, more entitled, more seeking privilege even than the gods. And later in book 9, we have a famous scene of an embassy to Achilles, and again he doesn't relent. So there's this sense that Achilles is taking this reaction to excessive lengths. So at this point, I want to highlight what I called this ring composition in book 1. So ancient authors often use this, and you can search and you'll find these almost everywhere in ancient texts, both Greek and biblical. It's called a ring composition to some extent. It could also be called a chiastic structure. So the chiastic, I'll just refer to that, for instance, as a way of visualizing it, is on the right, the top right there is named after the Greek letter chi, so which is kind of this X, stylized X. So according to that structure, we have marked here by an A, we have an event in a narrative that is replicated with a twist or with a mirroring of some sort at the actual end of the piece, whether it's a whole work, whether it's a book, whether it's an episode in a book. So the first and the last mirror one another. The second episode mirrors the second last, and so on. And there's a central episode that's not mirrored, okay? So if we were to look at book 1, we see that type of chiastic structure at work in very broad outlines. So the beginning begins with a plague sent by Apollo, and a prayer from Chryses to Apollo. At the ending, we see kind of the flip side of that. We see a feast and joy, the opposite of that, among the gods. So the second kind of episode there is a council of humans. It's council of the Greek men at the ships, trying to figure out what to do about this plague. And it's at this point that they decide that they're going to give back Chryses, and that Agamemnon decides to take Chryses. And this kind of mirrored to that, the second last episode of the book is a council of gods on Mount Olympus discussing Zeus's plan with the Trojans, allowing the Trojans to have ascendance. And then we have 2 mirrored episodes of Odysseus and Chryses, him departing with Chryses to take Chryses back to her father, and then an episode with him arriving with Chryses. And in the middle, we have the episode that I referred to where Achilles is pleading with his mother Thetis. So a touching moment of son and mother. So that kind of something to note in terms of, well, as I said, the Iliad, we'll see a bit of it in the Aeneid as well, of this conscious attention to structural detail where especially ancient authors are assuming that readers are going to pay careful attention to these notes of structure, and let's say, draw parallelisms, maybe get deeper meanings out of it, okay? So the other thing to note here would be in terms of that debate versus analysts and Unitarians that I mentioned in the introduction to Homer is, at least for myself, I see a lot of structure in Homer's epics. So for that reason, I am more of a Unitarian than an analyst. I see unitary structure. I see a design there of a singular poet, whether it's composing out of an oral tradition, that's most likely, but there has been a shaping hand, and it's not just pieces that have been randomly put together from different sources. Okay, so at this point, we're going to move to a general discussion of warfare in the Iliad. So we've talked a bit about book 1. We haven't yet gotten to the actual warfare as such, but in the next section we will. And as you approach the depiction of warfare, it's good to have these general ideas of what's going on in terms of the Homeric depiction of warfare in mind. So start with the structure of the armies. So the two sides are led by a king or a prince, and they have various troops that each have their own king or prince, and these are, as I said, they're large armies divided into war bands, and each war band comes from a particular city or region. An example is the Myrmidons led by Achilles, so it's a particular war band of coming from the region that Achilles is from. And the Trojans also have a band of various allies. They speak 1,000 different tongues, it's said in book 2. And so we have these two alliances of various war bands, and there's a commander-in-chief on each side. So on the Greek side, it's Agamemnon, so he's the kind of king among kings. And on the Trojan side, it should be Priam, who's the king of Troy, but he's too old to be a commander-in-chief on the field. So it de facto is Hector. So here's a map. I won't point out everything here, but here's a map showing you where some of the key leaders come from on each side. So we see on the right side, this is a map of what's present day Turkey, and this is Greece. And remember, Troy was up here, and Troy, just like the Trojan side, consists of, Trojan forces, but also these allied forces. And one notable unit is these Lycians. Glaucus and Sarpedon are two famous warriors from there. And again, I won't go through all of the Greeks on the other side, but we mentioned Nestor comes from this region of Pylos. There's Sparta in here, and this is obviously where Menelaus comes from, this region of Laconia. So we have a large armies on each side coming from basically all of that region of surrounding the Aegean Sea. The battlefield itself takes place on this plain between the Greek camp, and if this is kind of a zoom in of the map that we just saw, Troy's here, the Greek camp here. Notice, I'll just note that the present coastline, because of buildup of sediment, is up here actually, and it takes place between these, and these two rivers come into play actually later on. So the armor used in the warfare that's described here. So the armor of Agamemnon, for instance, is one set of armor that's described in quite a bit of detail. I won't refer, but I'll refer you to the citation there, book 11, line 17 to 52, if you want to check this out. We won't go read it right now, but it's but based on that description, we can see that it's armor that's composed of two plates, shoulder guards, and kind of these bands or belts, right? See how it's not just one solid piece, it's these kind of bands sewn together, or belts sewn together. And this is very similar to a late Bronze Age Mycenaean armor specimens that we actually have here in the Museum of Thebes. It's called the Thebes specimens. And so we have a sense of this reflecting, let's say, actual Mycenaean age armor. Sometimes there are a few depictions where, because remember, Homer's writing slightly after the Mycenaean age. There's a few hundred years intervening. So there's some references that of maybe tactics or materiality that was probably not around at that time. But for the most part, what he's describing is reflects kind of the armor that you would have seen in Mycenaean warfare. So most of in terms of their gear, the warriors are equipped with a set of two spears, which are often thrown, and the Greeks in particular are described as well greaved. So the greaves are those usually metal that protect their shin, their lower legs. The helmets of various designs are described, so quite a variety of helmets. So they're sometimes made of bronze. There's sometimes boar's tusks that I think we saw that in the previous. Yeah, see this helmet is boar's tusks. See all those white little ribs there. And the chariots. So the leaders are driven to battlefield in chariots, and the rest of the troops walk. And then the other thing to note is the chariots really are used just as a mode of transport to get to the battlefield. They're not, at least as depicted by Homer, there were in the Mycenaean age, there were some examples of chariot warfare, but for the most, solely in Homer, they're basically a mode of transport. There's no kind of coordinated battles of chariots. So the shields, the shield will in particular, the shields will be very important when we get to book 18. We'll have a very long description of a divinely crafted shield newly crafted for Achilles. But there are other types of shields described. Mostly they're circular, as is the one that's described in book 18. But some of them are these kind of full-length body shields that are that you see on the right. And Ajax's shield may have been like that. It's sometimes described as a rampart. And then on at least one occasion, Hector was bearing this type of body shield because in the description, his ankles and his neck both clash the dark hide of the rim. So that could only happen if we have a longer shield. That's in book 6. Archers, I mentioned archers quickly in this, the introduction to the course around war and literature themes. So I mentioned how archers generally get a bad rap, especially in Homer. So they're often, as I mentioned, decried because they're not having to bravely stand up to hand-to-hand combat, so to speak, or to close combat fighting. But there are some archers in the Iliad, despite this, as I said, bit of a reticence to valorizing them. There's the Locrian contingent, who are all archers, and they also fight with slings. And the narrator says they also had no love for stand and fight encounters. Again, this aversion to close combat fighting. But other than the Locrians, the archers operate individually. So it's not as though they have a coordinated attack, that they all volley arrows at the enemy as a way of kind of a strategic long-range attack. No, they're operating individually after individual targets. So in the Battle of Agincourt, which we'll talk about when we get to Henry V. The English victory was largely enabled by this kind of larger group effort of archery, as opposed to this kind of individual picking of targets. As I mentioned, they're referred to as cowardly, and I mentioned this Diomedes, who, after being wounded by Paris, replies, "So brave with your bow and arrows, big bravado, glistening lovelocks, roving eye for girls. Come try me in combat, weapons hand to hand. Bow and spattering shafts will never help you then. You scratch my foot and you're vaunting all the same, but who cares? A woman or an idiot boy could wound me so. The shaft of a good-for-nothing coward's got no point, but mine's got heft and edge." So quite the powerful distinction there for Diomedes between his sword for close combat and Paris's weapon. So too, Idomeneus, the Cretan captain, brags to Meriones, second in command of the Cretans, while the latter is back from the front in search of a new spear. So he says, "Spears, if it's spears you want, you'll find not one but 20, all propped up on my shelter's shining outer wall. Trojan weapons, stripped from the men I kill. It's not my way, I'd say, to fight at a distance, out of enemy range. So I take my plunder, spears, bossed shields, helmets, and breastplates, gleaming, polished bright." So the thing to note there too is the kind of these prizes that one gets from battle. So one prize we saw was a concubine. That might, it would be if you sack a city, that type of thing, maybe bring back as a war prize, a concubine. But other prize would be after vanquishing a hero. You in these Homeric epics, it's the victorious warrior strips them of their armor and takes that as a type of war prize. Now, what makes it, I guess, an honorable war prize is that they were able to take them. They were able to take them because they were that close. They were that fighting hand to hand, so to speak, as opposed to the archer is not going to be able to do that. And this is a distinction that Idomeneus really highlights here. And Hector, again, another kind of similar point here, urges his fellow Trojans to storm the Greek walls in Book 15. "No more standing back, no fighting these Argives at a distance, kill them hand to hand." So that's kind of on the one side, this, as I said, this denigration of those who fight with missile weapons, notably archers. But the insults against archers are usually lobbied, well, almost always lobbied against the enemy. Archers that are helpful to the army on one's own side are praised. So Aeneas praises Pandarus' archery skills and urges him to attack Diomedes with his bow in Book 5. We see Agamemnon praising Teucer for his archery and promising him a great gift when they finally sack Troy. And Idomeneus praises Teucer. So Idomeneus, the same person I just mentioned who had that speech kind of against distance fighting. And the other thing to note too is that the archers, it's not as though they're commoners or lesser people either. They're all noble, they're all highborn. Paris is an archer. Odysseus' archery skill is highlighted in the Odyssey. We have the trick of the bow that he's able to string and then able to aim the arrow through 12 axe heads that allows him to stump the suitors in the climax of that epic. So these are obviously great valorizations of the skill in archery. So I want to talk a bit about warrior ethos and generally as well. So as I've mentioned, Homer's heroes, that they can be distinguished in words and deeds, so politics and war. And Odysseus and Nestor are the primary examples, at least on the Greek side, of the former being shining when it comes to wars and politics. And obviously Achilles and Hector are the two champions that are most celebrated for their warrior deeds. And through excellence in war, the Homeric hero can expect to achieve honor and glory. Others will talk about his virtue and tell stories about him. But there's a duty to being this warrior as well, right? Again, in addition to this kind of selfish quest for seeking self-praise, there's this notion of the duty of the warrior. So because of their wealth, their power, and their status, as the elite of the community, they're obliged to protect the city from harm. This is a famous vase showing a relief of images from the fall of Troy, the Mykonos vase. So according to some scholarly interpretations of this relief, it was to remind the elite that a similar fate could await them if they failed to protect their city. So the murder of women and children, the rape of women, and them being sold into slavery. And there's a reference there to a good, as I said, interpretation that really draws that point home. So this is, again, a reminder of the duty of the warrior to protect the city, or else these types of atrocities, the atrocities that we know is in the background of this Troy story of the Iliad, will happen that could happen to your own city. So, for instance, in book 12, Sarpedon describes to his comrade Glaucus. Remember, we talked about those heroes, allies of the Trojans from Lycia in southern what is today Turkey. So Sarpedon says, and this is the quote on the right, "Glaucus, why do they hold us both in honor, first by far with pride of place, choice meats and brimming cups in Lycia, where all our people look on us like gods? Why make us lords of estates along the Xanthus banks, rich in vineyards and plowland rolling wheat, so that now the duty's ours. We are the ones to head our Lycian front, brace and fling ourselves in the blaze of war." So again, the duty is to be at the front lines because of these privileges. You know, they give us these privileges because we do this. It's not for nothing. Okay, so we go to the front. We're the ones meeting the danger head on. We're not fighting at a distance. Brace and fling ourselves in the blaze of war. So a comrade strapped in combat gear may say, "Not without fame, the men who rule in Lycia, these kings of ours who eat fat cuts of lamb and drink sweet wine, the finest stock we have, but they owe it all to their own fighting strength. Our great men of war, they lead our way in battle." So there was a sense, let us say, of so that's what we might call today social or income inequality, you know, that type of thing, which is a big public policy concern today, right? There's this sense of that inequality being earned or because of a certain duty, you know, like maybe the 0.1% of society would get a bit of a, today would get a bit of a softer go of things if they paid their fair share, so to speak, in taxes is when, you know, they have their duty to pay back to the community, and that wealth that they've amassed or can be used at the front lines of battling poverty of children or other social ills. Hector voices this duty to fight for the community as well. So the Greeks are pinned to their ships, and Polydamas interprets an omen as a sign for them to retreat. And Hector dismisses this omen and insists on pressing on. He says, "Fight for your country. That is the best, the only omen." This is book 12. And we'll also look at it in the next lecture, what's called his famous speech on the warrior's creed. So we'll look at that for sure in book 6, another important articulation of this point. So that's kind of the warrior ethos, the duty of the warrior. according to the Homeric epic. And I also want to point out this notion of kind of the nobility and beauty, how they belong together in this sense. And this is very Greek. This is very, you don't see this really in other literatures, that's for sure. So in the Greek sense, excellence, so virtue, excellence, what makes a warrior great, let's say, and nobility, so arete is a word for excellence or virtue. They express themselves in beautiful physical form. So there is some sense of that in other cultures, that virtue expresses itself in its physical form. But this notion that that virtue is tied to kind of a beautiful form is very, very, very Greek. So ancient Greek word for beautiful and noble are the same word, kalos. Okay, so the episode with Thersites in book 2 is an interesting example of where this is really borne out. So Thersites is referred to as the ugliest man who ever came to Troy, and he's petty, he's spiteful, and he spits venom on the leaders of the Trojan camp. He's despised by Odysseus because he's a commoner and a coward. So his social station, the way his virtue is expressed in action, it's not expressed in action, that he's a coward, right? And it also expresses itself in his physical form. Let us say he's doesn't have this kind of physical, beautiful symmetry of form. He's ugly and deformed. And Odysseus famously beats him in book 2 because he's out of line, so to speak. So we have this kind of beautiful and noble Odysseus versus this, let's say, ugly and base / common Thersites in conflict within the Greek camp. And I'll just close here in terms of this notion of warfare as such in the Iliad by reminding you of this theme of the limits of representation. Okay, so because of the scale, there's too many individuals. That's what we remember said. Both armies are very large, consisting of thousands and thousands of individuals. We wouldn't be able to follow the story of each individual. So the impacts on them, their families, what have you, would be too, the scale would be too much to try to encompass. And also this notion that the death of the soldier marks a limit point of experience that no one can describe. So there's this quote here from book 12. Now squad on squad, gate to gate they fought, but how can I tell it all, sing it all like a god? The strain is far too great. So the narrator expressing here in book 12 this sense that only a god could try to represent all of this. And this is part of the point of the invocation of the muse, is to inspire the poet to try to sing, to try to be able to represent beyond the limits of the human expression. But in book 12, there's this kind of sense of a sense of the impending failure of any attempt to try to represent those limits. So in this lecture, I'll close with that. So in this lecture, we've looked at book 1, especially with respect to what's going on in this battle of Agamemnon and Achilles in terms of their struggle for honor and glory, and how that makes sense a little bit in the Homeric world that's presented to us in the epics. We talked a bit about the ring structure of book 1 and how Homer's, to my mind at least, a poet that's giving us this kind of crafted vision with structure, and it's not just a kind of random collection of of different threads of stories. And then we talked about warfare in the Iliad and how it's representing Mycenaean age, late Mycenaean age warfare that may or may not have happened in the historical Trojan War. And at next lecture, we'll talk a bit about kind of an overview of what happens in books 2 to 8. You don't need to read those books, but in order to make sense of the epic, I'll go over some of the highlights so you know what you've missed. And we'll talk about book 9, which I've asked you to read, The Embassy to Achilles. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.